Welcome to SALEStrainer Online, the first session of what is probably a period that has represented a little bit of adversity, but I must say that inside of this space, I see nothing really but opportunity. And some of you might be waiting or sitting there saying to yourselves, why would Mark start list and sell with buyers when typically I spend a lot more time focusing on the GML, the getting more listings, and that will certainly be the case as we go forward with list and sell online. And quite often, a lot of you might be thinking, well, why isn't he focused on prospecting, which actually brings those listings to us? And again, that will be a major focus. But as this COVID starts to settle in, and who knows where it's going to go, it falls to me to, I believe, lead you through what on the surface looks like adversity, but most certainly will render itself to be opportunity. And, you know, the main theme that we've had with this is survive, then thrive. And this is, or the period we're in right now is strictly speaking survival mode. So the thing that I want to preface what we're about to talk about with is to say, keep calm and carry on. Whatever you do, don't panic. The environment thus far, and I'll be the first to let you know if it's time to pack up and run for cover, but the environment thus far is one that I'm very comfortable with. I can honestly tell you that it is one that, to my mind at least, is not just palatable, but one where opportunity is typically, or pretty much, out of control. I'm very, very happy with what I'm seeing at the moment, and basically of the mind that if we follow some certain protocols, many of you are going to be looking forward to not just surviving through this, but more importantly, to a level of prosperity that you probably never counted upon. In fact, I think the opportunity is so rife that you'll not only take market share, because the market itself will probably diminish for some time, but you will be setting yourself up for a level of prosperity you probably never thought was available to you. So just understand that. Now, the other thing that I'm going to be talking about today is your preparedness to work on in despair. And if there's one thing that I can ask you to write down right now, if you are indeed taking notes, and that is just what I said. You see, in the endeavor of any formidable objective, or when you're facing adversity, it pretty much always looks like failure in the middle. And right now, it's looking pretty tough. I would imagine your real estate market is most likely looking pretty tough. And what we need to focus on in and around buyers is, number one, stabilizing the anxiety that they're most likely, the buyers themselves are going through. So there's 3 words I want you to write down and hang on to, because it doesn't just apply to buyers. It also applies to property sellers that are out there. And in a lot of ways, it probably applies to you. What you need to be in this situation is empathetic, but certainly not sympathetic. Do not, if you can help it, let the state of what's going on run away with you. So I say, very clearly that what you need to do is put all of your energy at this stage of the game into surviving and then hopefully thriving as we move forward. So the survival stage, you're going to be going through what I believe is a lot of work without feeling there's a lot of reward, because where the market is traveling right now, and I'm sure many of you would be experiencing this, those residual sales that you had are starting to dry up. Some of them might have went south, predominantly because the buyers got cold feet with all of the talk of the market going backward. It might be some of your owners, and that's just something we'll be dealing with not this week, but early next week, when we start talking about how to stabilize those sellers that you currently have, and how to actually move forward with prospective sellers that you're likely to have. So conversely, you might be now experiencing a situation where the buyers are sort of back offing. Many of them start talking about, well, you know, prices seem set to come back by a percentage. I mean, that's an unquantifiable number at the moment. But in any event, they're balking or at least having a go. You might even have some owners that are ringing you and saying, are there any struggling fish out there? Is there anyone that's desperate to sell? And what could I buy it for? So what I want to talk to you about is engaging the buyers. Now, as crazy as this might sound, it's not about making sales at this stage. You see, because we're going to go into the doldrums, because there's going to be an enormous disparity between what owners believe they ought to be paying and what the sellers believe they should be getting. So many sellers are lamenting, many of them panicking, and many of them have missed the boat and are almost praying to try and figure out, you know, what they need to do to move forward. So in the engagement of buyers, we need to re-engage them. We need to do certain things, and I'll just start from the top, to do certain things to restore the flow of buyers, to build you, in many ways, a bank of buyers, because as we work on the other side of the equation with prospective sellers and those that are currently listed, and then eventually, and the flow of incoming listings, when we get them to get the head around what the market's doing, we can bring them together. And I'm seeing, I mean, probably the best way to explain it is I'm seeing a lot of agents that are more or less saying to buyers when they're offering something really low, that's ridiculous, and kind of go away. But that buyer, although they might at this point in time appear to you at least to be unreasonable and a problem and in the way, they could be someone you're looking for tomorrow, next week, or the day after, depending upon what happens. So the first thing I want to talk about in engaging your buyers is that you need to advertise to promote inquiry. Now, this has been a forgotten art. I mean, realistically speaking, it has not been much of a case other than actually having to list the property and the buyers will come. List it and they will generally come. Given the current state of the market, that may not be the case. And one of the bugbears that I've had with advertising per se is that it's a forgotten art, that we don't know how to generate inquiry. So when some of you are saying that the buyers are drying up, that is probably because they're either reluctant because they feel like they're going to get the sell pitch from the agent and they're not real sure where it's going, or we're revealing way too much information in the advertisement, thinking that we're marketing a property well, but understand that advertising and marketing are two different things. I'm going to talk to you about how you market to establish confidence. Now, don't forget that marketing is the ability to create a perception that for someone becomes a reality. And what we have to do is overcome the anxiety. We have to overcome the fear that buyers are having. We have to overcome the reluctance they have to continue to pursue the search for a home, never forsaking the fact that we don't sell properties, buyers buy homes. And we'll talk about the things that you do to move from advertising once you receive the inquiry to then into the marketing space to establish confidence. We want to qualify each buyer to ascertain their capacity to actually buy. Now, this too is an area that's pretty much overlooked, or has been for more than a decade, purely on the premise that it hasn't really had to be engaged. Now, the reality is that the better you qualify a buyer, the higher the probability, the higher the likelihood that you are going to make a sale. So you don't want to be expending energy in areas where the buyers do not have the capacity to go ahead and buy a property. Then we want to communicate to ignite assurance. So when they're looking at the properties, remember that we're paid to persuade, and what you have to do is when a buyer makes the connection, you have to communicate the right words that creates the assurance. With that assurance, buyers then have the confidence to go ahead and purchase the property. Now, this is at the moment almost out the door, and this is where a lot of the problems are occurring because the agents themselves aren't doing a lot in communication to provide the assurance that buyers need to make the industry go forward. We then want to activate these buyers. We want to get them back active, those that do have the capacity, as I've just pointed out there, that we do take through the assurance. We want to activate them to ensure survival. So the sales that you're likely to make during this period are going to be fairly lean on the ground to, in some cases, almost none. So again, I make the point that as you go through this phase, it's almost like if we were sailing the doldrums. So we've come through, the wind started to die down, but now it's pretty much stopped and the wind's out of the sails. And the reality is that the sellers are kind of stuck in an area where they've either withdrawn from the market thinking they'll come back later and everything will be okay, which is a fallacy, or they're thinking that they'll just batten down the hatches and forget about it altogether. You know, and the funny thing is, and I'll talk about this more when we talk about communicating with owners, most owners, if their motive is such that they do need to sell, are hanging on to little more than protecting what is most likely the bank's equity. I'll get to that later on. It's not what we're talking about here today. What we want to talk about is exactly what you do right now to re-engage those buyers and to eventually move down to the bottom to bank those buyers, to bank them up so that you've got a wall of buyers to recover as the doldrums dissipate and as we get the owners to come to terms with what the market has done and the buyers are in that space. If you're the agent that has been banking those buyers and communicating with them regularly to create the reassurance, you will get the activation in place and you will free it up and you will make sales. And of course, I hope you can imagine that as we get through this, the agent that has a bank of qualified buyers will be the person that not only a lot of these sellers will return to if you've engaged them on the same platform, but they will be attracted to you, even sight unseen, basically by the activity that you promote inside the areas. So the initial protocol in terms of advertising for buyers, the property buyer protocol is to advertise. Now, remembering that advertising, and I hope that you are taking notes, I hope that you are taking this on board, the premise of advertising is to create an inquiry. Now, the creation of inquiry is not achieved by giving people all of the information. What you want to do is establish the connection with the buyer, then create the conversation. And it's at that stage you decide whether you divulge further information in and around the quality or the qualification of that buyer. So in advertising, we have some simple ideals that we want to maintain in advertising for inquiry. And the first one is making it easy to buy, making it easy and accessible for them. So what you want to do is ensure that you are readily accessible. We want to promote an idea that we give away enough information to cause the buyer to call, and then we move into a space of qualification, a technique that they won't even be aware that you're doing. So we want to qualify them without them being aware that they're being qualified. Then we know that we need to create the assurance through communication and the list goes on. So if I go back to that initial slide that I talked about, it's just about a process and how we process those buyers. So there has to be an idea that buyers can feel comfortable conversing with you. They can feel comfortable saying, we believe the market's going to come back 10%, 20%, whatever it is, and you can still engage that conversation. A very important factor, one that I've been sharing mainly with the real estate rock stars and a lot of agents that I work with on a one-on-one basis, is I've heard all the arguments. I understand the premise by which we talk about ranging properties, having offers above, in between, indications, all that sort of stuff. The time for that is no longer now. I cannot begin to tell you how important it is to ensure that you are giving buyers a specific reference point. Now, yes, this does not mean that you won't have buyers still wanting to offer considerably less than the asking price that you might put on it. That will still continue irrespective, but I believe it will lessen the blow, and in any event, it will cause inquiry. Now more than ever, sellers will be referencing properties on a price point, and that will create their inquiry. So please, I don't know how you want to engage this. And again, I'll be talking about this early next week when we start to talk about how you communicate, definitely with your existing sellers, how you go about the pricing question with incumbent sellers, all that sort of stuff. But it's basically, we've got to have a price, not a guest. Any buyer that's looking at property and is left in the space of trying to guess what it is that an owner wants will struggle at the other end. So this really needs to be cleared up, and as soon as is practicable. You also need to have a range of properties. So the days of focusing heavily on one-on-one arrangements, and I believe that's going to change anyway as we start to progress forward, to be saying, given the state of the economy, to an owner that you need to invest several $1,000s to market a property. I think that's almost behind us. We're doing a lot with Property Marketer over the next few days for those that, for all of you that are will be using Property Marketer, for you to create a direct link to sellers, to buyers, but importantly, being able to do that and offer it to your sellers for 3/5 to bugger all. So we want to make sure that we keep this economical, but the thing that you want to promote is not just individual properties, but a whole range of them. So to a buyer, if they can look at a veritable smorgasbord, this is what's going to generate inquiry. Now, I want to come back to it just so that you understand, it's not going to sell houses, but it's going to open up the line for buyers to be inquiring. So the agent that has the lion's share of property available is most likely to generate all of the inquiry. And once you've got that inquiry, then you can go through the qualification process. Then you can work out who it is that you want to work with. And then you can start to run the process of matching buyers to property. Convenience, not confusion. Don't get overly protective. I mean, I could not impress upon you more that you've got to make it easy for them to contact you. So if you're putting a mobile phone number on there, absolutely ensure that it's answered by a human voice, and you always have time to answer these questions or run these conversations with buyers. If that needs to be through one line, make sure that that works well. Don't make it known that you won't be answering emails or otherwise. How that particular buyer gets to you is entirely up to themselves, but you've got to have a system that allows you to report back. Now, here comes the big thing, and I really need you to pay attention in what you do in advertising. There's a simple analogy around this, and I can tell you that from the perspective of a buyer, although you will feel like they're driven by price, in the first instance, they will be driven by the connection they feel to what the property either looks like or the way that it reads. So what we want to do is we want to provide certainly a up front, mainly visuals. Now, I've said this to you all many, many times as it relates to marketing, that the most popular books when you were growing up are picture books. That's never changed. So the primary consideration is giving images that would generate inquiry. It does not mean being overly thorough with the images. So we just want to have enough there so that when a seller looks at that advertisement, they say, gee, when a buyer looks at that advertisement, they say, gee, that looks good. So if they say, gee, that looks good, we want to be very selective about the images that we use to cause them to say that, but we also want to omit the images that might make them say, oh, it's got that, not really looking for something like that. So, and then when it moves to the text or the subtext, it's the same fashion. So I said less is more. The less you say, the more powerful typically it is. So I would suggest to you that you want to have a sentence that really doesn't comprise of any more than 20 words, maybe a few bullet points, but you want to put in anything that becomes a hook. So the sentence must be one where the buyer says, gee, that sounds good. Now, if you've got a coupling of the two, they're looking at an advertisement, they say, picture makes them say, gee, that looks good. And then over here, the text says, gee, that sounds good. It's now a balance of, once you've got the hook in, knowing what to leave out that will cause the inquiry. So even if I was putting in bullet points, I would be very quick to put in those things that are relatively standard. But, you know, if it had 3 bedrooms, I probably wouldn't put that in there. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, but doesn't that mean I've got to field a whole lot of calls? When someone says how many bedrooms it's got, you've got to say 3. They say, well, we were looking for 4. But recognise you've got the buyer on the phone. You've received the inquiry. And given that you have that inquiry, you can now work with it. Notwithstanding that a lot of these sellers are most likely going to be moving at the same time. So in advertising, we need to start to break away from this information age where we've been giving people all the information they need, and beyond that, so an oversupply of information, which can quite often sell them back out of the process of coming or looking at the property for sale. So the inquiry is killed because they've given too much information and they decide the property's not for them. You have to get out of that space. You have to get into the space where you're saying, I want to generate as much inquiry as I can. If that buyer's going to disconnect on this property, it needs to happen in the conversation that I have with them. But if you have all of these buyers coming to you, then we can confidently move into the next space where we start to look at how we then market that property. And what we want to do in marketing to the owners, remembering this is about creating the perception, is to stabilize the anxiety they have, dispel the Armageddon they might be feeling about the property market and that the bottom's going to fall out of it. And they need evidence to see that it is working, that the market, the cogs are still turning for the real estate market. And given that they need to find a property, they ought to participate, notwithstanding the fact that price, which I believe is secondary to them making the connection with the right property, needs to take place. So in marketing to buyers, we want to market to establish confidence. And what do we need to buy? Well, you've heard me say this many, 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 many times before, but if I move into the idea of video advertising or virtual open for inspections, I would encourage you as best I can to back away from this. Now, I'm not talking about not doing videos. I want to be very clear about where I believe you ought to go with this. Yes, you do need a full feature video of a property, given that a lot of the marketing that we're going to have to do should run online. But in the advertising space, I believe that you need a video that doesn't run much more than for 15 seconds. Inside that 15 seconds, you want to advertise. If I just jump back to what we were talking about. So you would just show some footage that shows something that makes someone go, gee, that looks good, and has some very short and sharp subtext that makes them say, gee, that sounds good. I wonder if. Now, if they call you and you've gotten their details and you've moved through to qualify, it would be at that point that I would be very comfortable to then distribute to them the full length feature video. Because if I then give them that full feature video and they've got that information, I already have the buyer contact details. So I basically have them as a buyer and I can move from there. So in marketing to establish confidence, yeah, we want to move to the full feature video. Then we can give them comprehensive information. So if they want to know stuff like council rates and all this other stuff that seems to find its way into advertising these days, you can then release it. Now, I'm sure that some of you are probably sitting there and not having known any different and going, well, how do you get around this with REA and all that sort of stuff? Believe you me, they would be in reconfiguration mode right now. And if nothing else, I am very confident that we can move away to So Justin, to start, so in the video, would you say for the full video, please inquire? Absolutely. You know, so what we want to do is we want to create a video that's about 15 seconds that you pop out there. Now, many of you might see, which I'm going to ask many of you to do, are the short feature videos that I do for List and Sell. They take very limited time to make. You can edit them down so they're short and compact. And I like to keep those inside of 30 seconds. But if I was thinking about property videos right now, I would be saying to myself, the best place to actually do this is to focus on keeping them around 15 seconds. It gets to the end, it has a call to action for them to inquire, nothing more, nothing less. And if you had there for a full feature video inquire here, I reckon that you are now generating inquiry from qualified buyers, but also imminent prospects that likely be looking to active property sellers, or what we've always called active property sellers. So that's when you give away the comprehensive information. Now, aside from that, once you've actually got the inquiry, we now need to market confidence to them. So in the same way we've talked about SMSing sales as they occur to current listings that are on board, in the same way that we've said, send SMS texts of your success results to active property sellers that are imminently looking at putting their property on the market, so too do I believe that you need to SMS your market results to buyers that you have on board. They need to see that properties are selling. And I've said this a million times in most marketing capacities, in most of what I do in and around advertising, that people are ostensibly like sheep. And given that they're like sheep, they will follow each other. So if they see the SMS marketing of the results, this will give them the confidence to then say, so we're marketing to establish confidence that other people are buying, so why don't we re-engage the prospect of doing that too? So again, and this is an unprecedented move, because you know that I've always been very, very heavy on only providing the accolades of prospective sellers. But given the current climate, which is unprecedented, we are in uncharted waters, notwithstanding that I believe, at least at this point, that it's going to be very reminiscent of the early 90s and the way that that market operated. And again, for some of you, you might be saying it's very reminiscent of the GFC. Now, I think there's a lot of other mitigating factors that are going to make this far tougher, but that's no reason for us not to train and figure out how to overcome this. So I believe if other buyers could see other buyers going ahead and buying, and this was done through accolades, notwithstanding that from Friday this week, you'll be able to actually distribute those, even turn them into margin ads, that this in turn is going to cause the buyers to have some confidence to re-engage the prospect of selling. And the same with two views. So when you actually have those two view websites out there, and some of you will be delighted to hear that we're figuring out how you can point those two view websites directly at buyers, and that will in turn drive the inquiry directly to you. It's always been able to do that, but in a far greater capacity. We're looking so that we can actually get those 2-view websites into something like your Facebook Marketplace, onto your Google AdWords, into margin ads, that sort of thing, so you can drive that inquiry back for a relatively cheap amount of money. So we really want to avoid the expense that goes through marketing. And again, I'll talk about that as it relates to buyers. But as those properties become sold, especially if that buyer has seen it or been told about it, to push that out and for them to see the sold moniker on that property, again, establishes confidence. You are marketing the perception of confidence, and that becomes totally relevant, totally important. So the next phase that we talked about is the qualification of buyers. So the property buyer protocol is to qualify. Now, for many of you, this will be an entirely different premise, given that you've thought, well, if someone looks up and they're talking about buying, they typically, in most cases, are okay when they're financed. You might ask questions around that. Or at the very least, if they haven't got their finance on board, they are usually on top of the fact that they can go ahead and buy. So we just run the assumption that they have the capacity to buy. But the reality is, in the market that we're going to go into, there are going to be fewer buyers on the ground, an overwhelming number of properties, and the qualification of buyers becomes very important, because there's so many properties that you've got, a number of buyers, you can find yourself bogged down in constantly communicating and providing information to buyers that aren't qualified, which is a time drain and it's unnecessary. Now, the qualification process, and I want to make very clear that we understand this, it's about qualification, not interrogation. It's done in a very undetectable way, so most buyers don't realise that you're actually doing this, and we want to be very mindful of that they don't feel like they're under interrogation. This will just cause them to clam up at the very least, but more importantly, run from you because you seem like you're just a little bit too high pressure. So we want to avoid that. But I say success with buyers is directly related to lowering the odds of probability. The better the chance you have of making sales. So what I want you to understand is, if you can qualify a buyer's capacity to buy, and then you're showing them properties, the better qualified they are, the greater the probability of you making sales. So it falls to you to learn technique of how to figure out whether a buyer has the capacity to do what they're indicating they have the capacity to do. The most important pre-qualify question, and one that you're going to become, I believe, or at least I hope, competent in an ad nauseum basis, is what I call the pre-qualify question. Now, all you have to do to engage this question, which I'm pretty good at, is know when to act dumb. If you act dumb, it ends up being the smartest thing that you can do. So just giving you an understanding of how this works, if a buyer called in to the agency and they said to me, I've just seen something online, or I've just seen something in your 2-view, I've just seen something in REA, whatever the case might be. If you're lucky, they've gone out for some fresh air and they say, I've just driven past a for sale sign or something like that, and they call you up about it. I then just immediately move into a very vague manner where I say, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Did you want to buy a home? Now, to all of you sitting here right now, this might seem like a very straightforward, or in some cases, a dumb question. But here's the thing. How the buyer, the prospective buyer, answers this question tells you a lot about their qualification, their capacity to buy. So I just go, do you want to buy a house? Now, let's just say that person says to me, well, mate, of course, stupid, this is a real estate agency, isn't it? They've just told me almost straight away that they are a buyer. If the initial response is along the lines of, oh no, we're just looking at the moment, just getting an idea, for me, the alarm bells go off, because they're looking, but they're not pressing to find something. But where in the first instance, the person says, well, of course, stupid, this is a real estate agency, is it? I'll say, so you do want to buy a home? They go, yes. I'll then say, not today, I hope. I hate high pressure buyers. Again, for some of you, how you frame that up might feel a bit awkward, but typically then the buyer will come back to me and say, well, mate, if I can find something today, yeah, I would buy it. Now, to me, they've just passed the first hurdle and I'm brimming with excitement because that's a bona fide buyer. But it's how I frame the question up. And it's undetectable from their perspective as to whether or not, I'm basically going to buy it. So just want to get this very, very clear so that we do see that indeed the importance of how you ask that question. So again, I'm sorry, do you want to buy a home? They say, yeah, well, of course we do. Well, if we can, we'd love to, if we could find something. I then just go, not today, I hope, I hate high pressure buyers. And I see how they go ahead and handle that. Yeah. This is probably the most important facet for me that I want to move on. Now, let's just assume, because I do have to make mention of this here right now. If they say, no, we're just looking at the moment, right? I would then move, given that they're feeling like they're not that qualified, to my favorite prospecting question. Do you have something to sell? And they might go, well, hang on, I'm ringing about the buy. Yeah, we'll get to that. But am I right in my presumption that you're looking at a move and you have something to sell in the first instance? Because I want to find that seller. And that becomes equally as important as well. Yeah. So that question, that the importance of qualifying that buyer with that question, do you want to buy a home? This then leads us to the next phase of qualifying the buyers, where we want to start looking for certain characteristics. Now, I can tell you a buyer that has these very important 5 buyer characteristics is one that you want to latch onto because their capacity to buy rapidly increases. The first thing we want to check for is that they're very cooperative on the buying protocol. And it's at this juncture I need to make mention of something. I'm seeing that a lot of agents, in order to restore confidence in the market, are spending a lot of time about how you can view the properties, how you can show the properties, what they've got to do. I mean, in New South Wales right now, they're talking about the fact that you can only take one buyer through the house at a time. To my mind, that's all semantics. You've got to generate the inquiry first. You've got to get them locked in to the idea that things are still going forward. And then once they're engaged in that, then they're looking at the listings that you have. To me, the protocol and how you go about it is secondary. You need to sell the appointment first, and most importantly, you need to make it easy for people to surrender their information and identify themselves as buyers, because from there, we can move forward relatively confidently. All right, so we want to make sure that they're cooperative around that buying protocol. So those buyers that start telling you, just send me the full-length feature video and I'll let you know, and all that sort of stuff, and you come, they're generally not an operative buyer, because I've always said that cooperative buyers are operative buyers inside the marketplace. So you want to look for that fact that they are prepared for you to tell them how the process works, how they ought to go about that process in working through and making, I guess, the whole thing come together. The second thing is that they need to be decided upon the area of purchase. Now, I think this is going to be more important than ever in the marketplace going forward. So, and there's an easy tester for this one. In my conversations with them, I'll say, look, if they're saying to me that they're looking at a property that's I'm just using numbers, that's in suburb A where my market is, of roughly around 500,000, and I've got an adjoining suburb or one just a suburb away where the median price for a similar property is $100,000 less, at around 400,000, I might make this suggestion to them. I'll say, look, have you noticed in suburb B that there's properties like this that for 400,000. If they arc up, if they fight back, if they say to me, no, it must be in suburb A where mine is, because that's where my kids are going to go to school, or that's the pivot point for transport, or we've decided that we're going to live in that area and that's it. That's music to my ears, because they're telling me that it's narrowed down, and I'm not going to suffer the disappointment of them coming to me saying, we found something else and it's a better house, and you're looking at the suburb and you go, well, of course it is. The third consideration is that they're reasonable on property value. Now, this is going to be a difficult one given that the market itself is starting to fall back. But those people, particularly investors, that are ringing you and are just totally price specific, they're not generally the buyers that have the characteristics that are going to make for a relatively easy sale. That's not to say that they don't make sales. That's not to say that the market might not catch up with them. But generally speaking, these are going to take a lot of time. It's going to be quite a protracted process before you get them to the table. So in the good old days, when someone rings me and said, I'm looking for a bargain house, I'm just like, you're almost like discounting yourself with me, because I can see that you are price oriented, and that's most likely going to cause a headache for my owners. I just want to make a point at this juncture that some of you might be thinking for years, Mark's banged on about, leveraging the value beyond compare, getting prices for the property that are beyond compare. That's still the case. But you cannot argue the fact that the overall market, the overall comparative values come back, and relatively speaking, that has to come back. So the expectation on what a seller's likely to get has to be handled appropriately. This does not include dissuading or trying to block or push buyers away. If nothing else, I want to encourage them. And the price that we get and how we negotiate that is pretty much dealt with at the point of sale. And if you don't have buyers inquiring, if you don't have buyers to market to, if you don't have buyers to qualify, well, you won't be negotiating with anyone anyway. So this needs to be pushed back. So I'm looking for that characteristic, those that are reasonable on property value. The next one is that they're realistic on their property expectations, that they want a property that is relatively common to the area. Those buyers that start most of their inquiries with me where they're saying they're looking for something unique or they're looking for something that's special, that's a little bit of a red flag for me, in that most of the properties I have, 80 to 90% of them, are pretty much comparable in a whole range of ways. The style of the property, the accommodation that sits inside the property. So if somebody says to me in the area that I was working with, I'm looking for a property that's got 4 bedrooms, some sort of formal living area that's close to shops and schools, they just described more than 80%, probably about 90% of the properties that I have. So I look at it and I go, well, they're fairly realistic on their expectations, and that's a tick for that characteristic. Whereas if somebody says to me, I'm looking for something special, something that's vastly unique, again, that worries me, because the number of properties I have in that regard is limited, or sometimes I don't have anything at all. So it doesn't fit inside that characteristic. And last, but by no means least, the most important one is that they have a deadline on when they want to make the move. Now, this is a very, very easy one to vet out. I just say to them in conversation, when were you hoping to move in by? When did you need to move in by? When had you planned to be moved? Simple question, but if they say to me, Mark, like if we had found something, we will need to be there like yesterday. Again, it's just music to the ears, because they're telling me that they're an active buyer. If they have all these other characteristics in play, the probability of them buying has just dramatically increased positively. So now I actually have, as I'm moving through this space, I'm comfortably advertising for buyers. I'm comfortably marketing around confidence to those buyers. And now I'm moving into a space where I'm qualifying them, and I'm starting to build up a number where I can communicate with these people, and for all intensive purposes, start to free up the cogs that move the market forward. Now, I'm going to say this to you again so that you don't lose heart during this period. We are clearly moving into the doldrums. And in those doldrums, you'll be engaging in loads of conversations around this stuff that I'm sharing with you right now. And it'll feel at times almost fruitless. It'll feel like it's not going to come. But if you're having these conversations and you're looking for these aspects, I must tell you, you are ahead of the game, and you are dramatically increasing the likelihood of winning the game of listing and selling real estate in the climate I believe we're about to move into. The next step is to communicate with buyers, and the property buyer protocol is to communicate, to regularly converse with them. Now, you've heard me say over the years that you can ignore buyers and focus on listings, but in the environment we're going into, you simply can't afford to do that. This does not mean that you need to yield to them. It does not mean you need to surrender to them, but you need to be in regular contact, building up a professional rapport that promotes confidence that you're the go-to person for them to secure the property that they are ultimately looking to find. Yeah. So I say, speak empathetically to buyers. I see so much of this going on at the moment where several of the buyers, because of COVID, because of what's happened, are coming back at agents and saying, look, the property market's going to be stuffed. Things aren't going to work. And the agents are almost in denial, where we're just kind of freaking out because we're looking at something slipping away. And we're becoming argumentative about this. And even if they get to the offer stage, it's almost like we treat them with contempt that they're not playing ball on property values. But if you engage in empathetic disposition, which allows you to understand how they're thinking and feeling without being sympathetic, because in that case, your sense of logic will leave you. And in many instances, when I say speak empathetically, I say that some of us are speaking sympathetically, but that sympathy is coming from us. We're feeling sorry for ourselves. We're feeling desperate around this situation. And the language that you're using is not one that the buyer can rely upon that will restore any confidence. Blind Freddie can see that if nothing else, if the real estate market hasn't suffered a severe blow, definitely on a mass worldwide scale, economies have. I was watching some things last night. They're literally talking about the fact that we're not only definitely moving into recession, but there is a strong possibility that we could be looking at depression. I'm not selling you this to be a scaremonger. I'm not saying this to do anything other than the same conversation I would have with any buyer, with any seller out there. It's the reality of the situation, and it is a plausible possibility we simply have to embrace. So the question you need to be talking through with buyers, because we want to reignite this, remembering that buyers buy with emotion first. They buy homes, and it's how they feel about them. So the language that you've got to use in and around buyers is, how do you feel? How are you feeling at the moment? How do you feel about the move? How do you feel about the propensity, about the likelihood of you finding the property that you're looking for? These are the questions that need to be engaged with prospective property buyers now for you to create that professional rapport where they feel like they've made that connection with you and they can trust your judgment, they can come out of their hole and they can start to re-engage in the idea of locating a property that they're going to make their home and then moving to the space where they can go ahead and buy it. So reference homes, not property or houses. Remember this. When you're talking to a buyer, so sellers sell houses or property, but buyers buy homes. So I like to couple that word where I'm constantly saying, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about making this your home, which you're going to see when we get into negotiation? But coupling those two words together is making them feel welcome with the idea of utilizing your professional capacity and your time, and using the words welcome to feel to home. So I like buyers to feel welcome to work with me to feel their way home. I'll say that again. I like buyers to feel welcome to work with me to feel their way home. Focus on discussions, not sales. As crazy as this might sound, it's that old Farouk thing, I pay cash. What is it with wogs and cash? Put your money away. Put your attitude of making sales away. Just accept that this is going to take a little bit of time. Accept that you need to hang in there to get through the survival phase. And as you get through it, then we'll open up the opportunity for you to thrive. So your whole premise of connecting with these people should be around discussion, not about pushing the barrow on sales. Any pressure that you apply there will most likely be met with a disconnection, and you need to stay away from that. Do not interrogate, communicate. It's not a Q&A. It's not about you prying information. It's more about you asking open questions and letting them to download with you. In fact, the more time you spend hearing their concerns, the more likely you are to be able to free them up and then move them forward into a space that works well with these buyers. So again, I say, don't interrogate. Don't have them sitting there feeling, none of this stuff, you have to sell before you buy, flashlight in the eyes, freaking them out. None of this, have you had any other agents down to give you an idea on price? We'll get to that next week. I mean, how's that question going to go now? If you start appraising property, goodness me, anyone that contacts you, anyone that you're talking to about imminently putting their property on the market does not need an appraisal. They need help. They need a professional. Anyway, we'll get to that at a later date. So do not interrogate these people, communicate. And I say serve, don't swerve. Don't avoid what looks like a protracted where we get this attitude, you've got to spend a lot of time with these buyers, you're going to talk them off the wall, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, you do. If you're fair income about making it in this business over the coming months and into the future, you just have to adapt an attitude of serving as a professional first. Do this and the sales will evidently and eventually come. But focus too heavily on what you can get out of it. Takers are readily identified in an environment like this. The idea is for you to give and give to the point that it truly hurts as you go forward. All right, now we're going to activate them. How do we activate them? So we've gone through this, we've communicated with them. They're now starting to look at properties. We're opening it up to them. As Justin nicely said there, we might now sending them the full feature video. Maybe they're moving into the space where they need to go and view the property in a one-on-one arrangement. In comes the excitement, and we can now start to activate them around making the moves, at least, to re-engage the property market. So as we said at the beginning of this, it's about engaging your buyers. So the property protocol now is to attempt to activate them. If we can get them active again inside the market, this is where the magic starts to happen. This is where the magic starts to occur. So buyers buy, and this is the simple thing, with an emotional connection to a home. There's one constant that just won't change, despite many of you sitting there fully believing that there are going to be a certain number of buyers that are basically going to buy property based upon its asking price, based upon its price expectation. Now, that might be true in a very small minority of cases, but the reality is that buyers buy homes, and they do this emotionally. And if you're clever at the way you drive it to this point, the same consistent feature will always be there. If you can get them to make the connection confidently, and they have the capacity to pay more money, if they have the capacity to pay a price that is beyond compare, they will do so. But they will only do so if you, in the very first instance, create that connection first. So the whole idea is for you to match the buyers to the properties. Now, notwithstanding the fact that you're going to have, not so much now, but as the market starts to open up and the fallout of this starts to occur, there's going to be a glut of properties on the market. There's going to be a number of people that just can't handle the situation around their property. There's going to be loads of people out there right now. And I was only talking to one of our people this morning where we're discussing the fact that the reality is, if the market came back by 20%, if the owner of that property had borrowed 60 or 70%, the market comes back on an average loan by 20%, if that's true. And if they take a mortgage holiday for 12 months until that situation arises and that capitalizes on the loan, they are most likely going to have diminished equity, which means they owe more on the property than its actual value is, which is why I'm kind of fascinated at the moment, because many sellers are actually pulling back in the hope that things are going to get better. And that's a risk they shouldn't be taking, because all they're going to end up with, in my opinion, is diminished equity. We'll just leave that aside because that's a conversation for next week. But you need to understand that buyers buy homes first, and they do that through the attachment. Once they've found the home, they don't start sitting there saying, how cheaply can I get it? They say, how much do I have to come up with to get this property? And then, of course, where do I get the money from? Now, if that borders on being outside of their financial capacity to buy, well, that's something you've got to deal with as that happens. But just recognize in activating them, this is the most important part. And you've moved through here quite nicely. You've advertised, you've got the inquiry, you've marketed to those buyers, you've run the qualification processes, and you've been in regular communication with them. Now comes the part where you can activate them, you get them out there showing properties, and they're making that an emotional connection to the property. So when they're making that connection, here's how you govern the feedback. You use the words feel and you use the words home. I really need to pull up at this point. The one feature you won't notice, and I'll mention it again at the end, is I'm not using the word think. The singularly largest hurdle you'll have to overcome is if you allow your buyers to think about this, they will most certainly frighten themselves into not doing anything. And this needs to be recognized, particularly on your part. It's the most important thing that I can share with you. You need to focus very heavily on the words feel and home. So once they've looked at the property, it doesn't matter if they've gone in there by themselves and come out. It doesn't matter if they've gone in one at a time. It doesn't matter if you can't even go there, if you're all done up in a suit with gloves and all that sort of stuff. I don't care. When the conversation takes place after they've embraced the property, after they've had an initial response, I just say, do you feel like you could make this your home? Or I might take a different version. Do you see yourself living here? Now, this might invite them saying, well, yeah, but still okay, because they do see themselves living here. And now they're going to present to me the hurdles as they see them. It might not be the one, but it might be driving toward that one. And I want to keep those conversations alive. How do you feel about this home? How do you feel about it? And it's important, because I want them to tell me how they feel about it. And if they say this, but, I go, well, what would you change? Which is basically the next question. What would you change about this home were it one that you were considering? And that needs to be another one that's prevalent in your processes around what you're talking to buyers. So these are simply the questions, once you get through those initial stages that I talked about in viewing properties, of how you then can move to the negotiation of that property. So then we want to initiate negotiation. So if you have a positive response to any of those questions that we were just asking in terms of activating that particular buyer, you can now move into the space where you can comfortably initiate a negotiable position around that property. So I just initiated, I'll just say this simple line: what would you pay for the home? I'll say that again. What would you pay for the home? Now, many agents, when they look at this, they think about, when they find someone that wants to buy, they think about initiating the negotiation process, and they like to talk about it in the capacity of an offer. I totally disagree with that. Because if you become a master at asking this question, it gives you a commanding fallback position. So I say to somebody, what would you pay for the home? This then immediately leads, irrespective of what they say, and as crazy as this might sound to you, even if I had someone say, I would pay full price, I still come back with this line. No, no, no. That's an offer. I meant, and I'm nodding when I say it, I meant, what would you pay? Now, some of the best protocols, some of the best ideas are the simplest ones. If what I just demonstrated to you appears or feels oversimplified, so be it. The fact that it's simple means that it's easy to remember. Yet, so often I see agents stray from this. You see, if you invite an offer, whether you realize this or not as an estate agent, you are basically admitting to the buyer that you don't believe the asking price is valid. But if you say, what would you pay? And irrespective of what they come back with, you then follow it up with this line where you say, no, that is an offer. I meant, what would you pay? It's a commanding fallback position because you've literally thrown the hot potato at them. They've already said to you in the preceding questions that we asked that they see themselves living here, that they can make it a home. And now they're actually in their own minds questioning, what value they place on the home that they love. Now, the only thing that's going to limit them from increasing that is their capacity to pay, because we've already established that they would buy the property and make it a home. Or I could just say this, I could say, what if they say no? Now, the reason I ask that is because it usually follows this next question. So, no, I meant, what would you pay? Then they might say another number, which is a bit higher. I just go, well, what if they say no? Again, this is placing pressure back on the buyer. Now, at this stage, you might be thinking, I don't want to push them too hard, especially if the offer appears, if it's below asking price, relatively good, but don't be afraid of that. And I've said this, and one consistent thing that will not change, once a seller, once a buyer has found the property they want to buy, you have to make them fight for it. And the more you use this type of dialogue and the more they fight for it, the more they value it, the more likely that sale is to proceed and go through. Or I might say to themselves, do you consider yourself to be a fair person? Most people will say to this question, I know there are exceptions, but most people will say to this question, yeah, I do. I say, if this were your property and I came back to you with this offer, would you consider that to be fair? Tough question, granted, but it's one that they have to deal with. If this was your property, given you've just told me how much you love it, and I came back to you with this type of offer, would you consider that to be fair? To which then they'll say, most likely, maybe in. I say, well, why don't you give it your best shot, not your worst? Because I might then say to them, if this property were to sell at X amount of dollars above tomorrow, would you be disappointed? They go, yeah. So why don't you avoid that disappointment by giving it your best shot now, not your worst shot? So I might even say to that buyer, look, it's okay. I will tell them the fact that you made this offer initially and then you came up. I will let them feel that you are at your best point. But it's best for you and best for everyone, quite frankly, that at this point in time, you give it your best shot and not your worst shot. And that's what we ought to be focused upon. So often in negotiations, this moves us into the negotiation space, and often what is quite literally a few minutes. And then really, when we're talking about this in terms of from a chronological aspect, it's a very short space of time that this conversation takes place when you consider everything you went through in the advertising stage to generate the inquiry, everything you went through in the marketing stage, all that you went through in the qualification stage, all that you went through in the communication stage, you've activated these buyers, and now we're comfortably into this negotiable disposition, which is literally going to take a small percentage of the overall time that we've invested in this buyer. That productivity is exponentially increased by negotiation. What you do and say in this space is just about everything. And I can absolutely assure you, not just now, not just through the survival phase, not just through the median stage, but in the future, this is going to be tantamount to the validity of the success you have. Your ability to know what to do and say in those few minutes will determine the professional outcome you have as an estate agent. So I say your earning capacity is at its highest when you are negotiating, be it your fee, be it marketing investment, be it sales, or be it winning a listing. This is when it really counts. So I say inside negotiation that we have to pay attention to some very important factors, particularly in this space. And this does involve me talking from the buyer's side across to the sellers. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed that when a buyer makes an offer on a property, and this will remain true once they get to that space where they are now submitting their best offer, hopefully, or one that's a little bit under, and I'll give you some techniques around that. But if they are indeed pushing this, that basically what happens, the level of receptiveness from a buyer peaks on the same day. They are very keen to hear the owner's response almost straight away. And typically, if that is a push for a little bit more, they are most likely relatively receptive to increasing their offer somewhat within the capacity of what they can afford. I don't know if you've noticed, but at about midnight, that receptiveness kind of drops off. And if you speak to them the next day, it can quite often have found its way into remorse, where they're now starting to talk themselves out of it and looking at the negativity that surrounds it. Sometimes they go and get advice from family or friends. Sometimes they, unfortunately, seek the advice of another agent that they've been working with who generally tends to poo-poo it. Richard, I know that you know what I was talking about right now. So this sort of stuff can happen. But in any event, what we want to do is we want to figure out how we can have that negotiation take place on the same day as it does with a seller. Hey, I went back. Sorry, I'm just going to have to click that back here. All right. So we said that level of receptiveness peaks. Similarly, when you take that offer to the seller, especially if that offer ends up being below their expectation or below what they had hoped to achieve, they are usually non-receptive, as you can see here initially. So most of the conversations, even if you go down and meet them personally, even if it's relatively closer in the space, they'll look at you and they'll say, we need to think about it. We need to digest it. And typically that is usually overnight. And this is where the danger occurs, as I see it. And this is going to become way more prevalent now, mainly because you're going to have a lot more of this occurring, and really any negative trigger will send the buyer scurrying for the hills, scurrying for cover, and the owner may be digging in if you're not careful, and hanging on for way too long onto values that may not even be there. So we have to run a system that pulls these into sync. Now, I'll talk about this with a lot more prowess as it occurs on the other end when I'm speaking to an owner, but certainly with a buyer, this is the parts that you need to understand. So I say there's 7 steps to synchronize negotiations. The first one is that you get buyer interest, that you've gotten to the point where you've activated them, you've gotten to the point where they've got the full-length feature video, and now you've gotten to the point where they've inspected the property And of course, you are now starting to ask that question, do you see yourself living here? Could you make this a home? Could you make this your home? I'm sorry. What do you feel you might change about it? That sort of thing. And they move from there, and quite often they want something like a second inspection or otherwise, but they agree to that. They say, look, we'll need to come back and check a couple of things out, or maybe we need to go and talk to the bank or whatever it is. But no doubt you have what I refer to as buyer interest, and we look at that buyer interest and say to ourselves, well, we're on the way with the sale. So the next thing that you've got is a sale cooking, and you need to register that. You need to understand that there's going to be a breach, most likely, that needs to be gapped, particularly if you think they're going to come in below. So that offer comes in, or when it, sorry, not comes in, it hasn't come in at this stage, but we've got buyer interest, and we've got a hunch about where we think, hopefully, the buyer's likely to come in at should the negotiations be initiated. We also should know what the owner's expectations are, where they're hoping the eventual sale price will come in. It's at this stage we then move to the third step, which is sowing a seed. It's a very deliberate thing. What we do inside this space is we ring the owner, and the conversation goes like this. I'll do this slowly so that everyone can see it. In fact, I'll even pop out of this so that we can see exactly how I'd explain it on the large screen. Basically, I ring the owner and I'll say, hello, it's me. Now, if they say, who's me? There's your first problem, assuming I'm the listing agent. They should know who I am. I'll say, it's me. And I'll say, hi. I then go, look, I don't want to get your hopes up yet, but I think I may have found you a buyer. I'll say that again. I'll say, I don't want to get your hopes up yet, but I think I may have found you a buyer. Hope, think, may. Now, what does the owner automatically assume? They assume that I've got it sold. They assume that I've got a buyer, it's all going to be over with. But I've put that caveat on it. I don't want to get your hopes up yet, just in case it goes south. I'll then tell them about the nature of the inquiry. These people are from here. This is where they're up to. This is what they've sold. You know, I'll move into all that rhetoric. This is their capacity to pay. They've got their finance approved, whatever it is. Then I might even talk about the fact that they're going to come back for a second inspection. And then I'll say these very important words. At this stage, it appears to me they're going to come in at, and I'll hit them with a price. Now, this is where a lot of agents and I don't see eye to eye, but never forget the fact that I was selling 10 properties a month, 120 properties a year. And here's how the conversation would go. I would say, and I want to get your hopes, oh, sorry, we went to that. I'd say, at this stage, so if the property were on the market, let's just use some median numbers. The property on the market at 535,000. I might say, even if I think, and especially if the owner's actually said something, I've got to say what they said. The buyer, I'm saying, if the buyer's actually given me a number, I have to reveal what that number is. But I prefer it that they haven't at this stage. So I'll say, look, at this stage, knowing that it might come in at around late 4s, early 5 at worst, I'll say, look, at this stage, it looks to me like the buyer's going to come in at probably a figure around 470. And whatever number I say, I just shut up, because it's the reaction that I get to that number that tells me how the whole thing's going to go. So I could get anything from them absolutely exploding. 470, we told you when you first come down here, no way unknown. And they just take it off the market, we'll rent it, whatever the case might be. So any of these scenarios can come up, but I don't allow that to get in the way of me moving forward. Because here's what I know they'll do. Oh, sorry, then it could actually be the reaction might just be one of just, okay, well, let's see how we go. Now that would still tell me that things are likely to be good and they're probably accepting where we're at. And I'm doing this knowing full well how it is I'm going to negotiate the price up, importantly, but also that I'm most likely going to come in at a figure that's higher than the initial one that I said. And the important thing is now the seller, if they're a couple, even if they're an individual, will now spend that night or the next couple of days, depending upon when the second inspection it is, staring at the ceiling, mulling that number over. So it might start the conversation with, there's no way we take it, but what if? And they generally start to take that on board. And what this does is now bring the seller, at the very least, prior to the second inspection occurring, to be in the level of receptiveness to what might come at them because they've managed to deal with it. So if I go back into that space where we talked about those 7 steps, sorry. Oh, there it is. You'll see that we've moved through that, the sales cooking, we've now sown a seed. Then we can move into the next stage, which is the subtle approach. So what I then like to do with the buyer prior to the second inspection occurring is explain to them all that's going to happen once they've looked at the property, should they submit something that the owner is happy with, of how the buying process works. So in New South Wales, I would say to them, this is a contract. I used to have one in the car if I took them out there. I'm obviously not able to do this through COVID, but I might just send them a contract. Let's say that's the document you're going to need to sign. Here's how it works, operatively speaking, if there are cooling off periods, how that cooling off period works, what their liabilities are. The reason that I do all these things as soon as is practicable is because once they see the property they want to buy and make it their home, they go into an emotional state. And in that emotional state, they're not very receptive to the logic that surrounds it. So I want to be careful to ensure that they are prepared for that. And even when they're in that state of emotional duress, they don't see those moves as frightening or unorthodox. So that's how the subtle approach works, which is an acronym for Set Up, Buy to Love, Exchange. I then, once I've done that, so even in my conversations coming back here to sowing a seed, I would have said to the owner, if they really blew up, I should have actually said this to you before, but if the owner said, take it off the market, all that sort of stuff, I'd say, hey, I said that's where I think they're going to start. It's not where they start, it's where they finish. With your permission, I'm going to bring them down next Thursday and I will take a contract for sale with me, and assuming everything goes to plan and I'm able to negotiate them up to their best price, I will have them sign off a contract and leave me a deposit. Are you okay with that? Thereby getting the owner's permission to push them up to the best I can and get it locked off. So that when I come down to visit the owner and I'm going through the negotiation process, I can relive every step. We'll talk more about this when I talk about owners and how you actually get them across the line. But then I can relive it blow by blow and then hopefully have the owner agree in principle and maybe sign off, or leave it to me to get signed off, but at least I've got a signed contract of sorts. Then I might push in the contingent variables. Doesn't seem like a big deal now. These will become ever more important as we move through this COVID thing. So contingent variables are like settlement periods, how long it's going to take to settle, what are the conditions about that, rent back arrangements. Then it might have, goods and fixtures and fittings that are being left, and whether or not a pool table can stay, and obviously through COVID, that would be handy. What's actually happening with the pool equipment, and all these sorts of things come into play. Those contingent variables can materialize into better arrangements for your sellers and vice versa to make the whole deal stick and come together. And then there's going to be an even more important one, and I've noticed that this has become hugely prevalent and will be a very specific subject in more detail. But I will tell you in context right now that the nursing of sales is going to become more important than ever. If that bad building report comes in, it can unhinge the entire process. If there's a pest inspection that's not favourable, if there's a disagreement over something very petty, as I mentioned before, like, a pool table or something like that being left or not left, and this unhinges it, we have to prepare this in basically anticipate all of the go-wrongs before they occur. So what we're constantly doing with the owners, and we're constantly doing in the context here with the buyers, is warning them of all the hurdles that are likely to present themselves, and that they're perfectly normal, and to ignore them as you go through each phase to make it all work. So I'll spend more time on this as we go, But in the first instance right now, in working with buyers, so what would I do in nursing a sale? I would basically say to them, look, are you going to get a pest and building inspection? If they go, yeah. So, well, look, most likely typically with building inspections, they come back with what is more or less a maintenance list. So they come back and they point out all the things that need to be replaced, repaired or improved. Now, what I generally do is I might say a price that's around the property. So it's the $500,000 property. I say it usually comes back with a value of about $50,000 of repairs. Don't panic. That's relatively normal. At least you know what you do and don't have to do. Now, if there is anything that's not obvious at the moment, not obvious to the eye that comes up, well, then we might have an issue. But if you don't come back to me talking about having to replace gutters and things when you've actually seen the current condition, so that when that report comes back and it has those things on it, and it might have $30,000 worth of maintenance and repairs, and they go, well, Mark kind of told me 50, so it's just water off a duck's back. This is where it becomes important in the context of things, nursing sales. As I said, we'll spend way more time on this as we progress, but initially this is what needs to be handled, especially with those existing sales that you're seeing going south. Okay, so finally engaging your buyers, the last one, but by no means least, this is probably the most important thing that I can share with you, is you need to start banking buyers in the same way that you have a chase list for sellers. You now need to start banking those buyers and not getting uptight about the fact that they're saying to you, there's no way we pay this now, these properties are overpriced by 20%. Bank them in, especially if they're qualified, knowing that these are the buyers that are going to move you through the then stage and into thriving with your career. So I say no buyers means no activity, means no sales. In times of low inquiry, which is what we've got now, overqualification cripples activity. And giving them the lip and giving them mouth and that sort of stuff, that doesn't help either. Yeah? So basically the premise of everything that we've talked about here in engaging your buyers is to understand, to get the wheels turning again with buyers. And I hope that we've shared this, and I hope it's made a lot of sense, is to advertise in the first instance, stop giving away too much information, advertise to generate inquiry, understand that it's as much about the hook as it is what you omit. So what you put into an advert, remembering less is more, to make it either sound good or look good, is more important, than the amount of content. So what you omit, what you take away, can be the very thing that generates the inquiry, and that's what you need to be mindful of. The second stage is marketing to restore confidence. So those SMSs, sending out the same way that you're sending the sellers, all of these things in a practical vein is going to add up to you restoring confidence that the buyers start to engage again and start to look at properties and start to want to buy them. The qualification process dramatically increases the likelihood. So that initial question is by far and away the most important. When you receive a inquiry from a buyer, say, look, I'm sorry, did you want to buy a home? How they handle that, if it's affirmative, well, of course I want to buy a home. This is a real estate agency, is it? You then just be quickly moved to, not today, I hope, I hate high pressure buyers. If they go, well, mate, if I could find one today, I would. Bango, there's your buyer. There's the one that you're looking for. Remembering to keep up the regular communication. So we want to be absolutely certain that we're getting all of this information out and they're seeing all of the other buyers buying and they're happy and it's all working out, because the more they see that, the more likely they are to follow suit. The activation process, when you get them out there, just remember, if you want to initiate the whole thing, do you see yourself living here? Do you feel like you can make it your home? Using those most important words. Same with, if I come back to communication, feel and home. Stay away from the word think. The last thing in the world you want buyers doing, especially in this current situation, is thinking. And then finally, when you build this bank up, and a reminder, I said that it's very important that you do understand where we're going with this, moving through this space. We're going to go through a period of the doldrums where you're going to feel like nothing's happening. But if you're engaging these 6 steps with prospective buyers, you will come out of this with a bank of buyers that will not just sail you through the doldrums, that will not just get you through the survival mode, but will move you into the thrive space. So if they can rely on the discussions, you can build that rapport, you will indeed make sales. So I hope you've enjoyed that. This is the protocols that we need to engage in and around working with buyers, engaging your buyers. My name is Mark Dwyer, and thank you very much for joining me on this webinar.